So today on this channel, we're going to do something quite a bit different, which is an Arcane review. Now, I did do one of these for Season 1 on my old channel. You unfortunately can't watch it anymore. It is unlisted. But obviously, massive spoilers for Season 1, Season 2 of Arcane. If you haven't watched it, don't watch this video because it's worth a watch. And, you know, come back to this video after you have watched it and we'll talk about it. Now, this is just my opinion. I haven't really looked at anyone else's reviews, so hopefully this is just my unspoiled kind of opinions on some things. We're going to talk about stuff we like, stuff that I didn't like. But first, let's actually talk about what I thought about Season 1, just to kind of give you a quick impression of what I thought of Season 1. Obviously, I thought it was amazing. I thought the first act of Season 1 was probably the best intro to kind of a television series that I could remember, to be honest. I thought it was amazing. And, you know, part 2, Act 2 and 3, I thought of Season 1 were not quite as good as Act 1, but still incredibly good. I rewatched Season 1 before I watched Season 2 to kind of refresh myself, and yeah, I again came away thinking, wow, this is really amazing. I'd probably give the whole thing like a 9.5 out of 10. You know, just incredible television. So with that said, let's now talk about Season 2. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to go through the episodes. So we're going to start off here, you know, talking about episode 1 and kind of going through them, just like little bits that I liked, didn't like from each episode. And then, you know, after each act, we'll kind of review the act. And then at the end, obviously, we'll talk about the whole thing. So let's start with episode 1. And the first thing that I want to point out, and this happened, you know, more than just in episode 1, but this I think was perhaps the best example of it that came early on, which is just the different animation styles. They also did this sometimes in Season 1 as well, but I thought they leaned into it a bit more here in Season 2, and I just thought it was often some of the best parts of the show. I really like these scenes where they went for kind of different animation styles. I just thought it was really cool. And just in general, of course, like the animation of the show and, you know, the kind of production elements, let's say, of the entire show were, of course, incredible all the way throughout, even with parts that I didn't necessarily love in the story that we'll get into. But yeah, obviously the production quality is insane. Let's move on, though, to talking about the Council, which in this first episode, and in general, I even think in Season 1, the Council was probably the weakest part of the show. And coming into the start of Season 2, obviously with the Jinx, you know, destroying basically the Council and whatnot, I also again felt like the Council, this kind of part of the show, was again one of the weakest parts of the show, right? And it just, we're gonna get into kind of, you know, one of the major problems that the whole series had, but I think the Council is a good demonstration of, I think the Council even had this problem in Season 1, which is just a lack of kind of detail for the audience to understand what's really going on, right? So for instance, you know, we have multiple Council members die, but it's like not clear, are they going to replace them straight away? Should Caitlyn now be a counselor because her mum died? Is that how it works? Or we saw Jace get voted to be a counselor? You know, how's it gonna work? What is going on? And it never really gets explained, right? We just have these little votes of 2 to 1 when I think Jace maybe is still technically counsel, but he's not there. Like, you know, there was just like, if you thought about it for just like, you know, like a minute, like you could get confused of like, how does this work? One part of episode 1 that I really did like, and I think this is true for basically all of the first act, and maybe even all of Season 2, is Caitlyn's character. I thought was really good. Caitlyn, again, I felt like, you know, wasn't maybe the strongest character in Season 1, but the kind of, you know, Caitlyn coming out and really like hating Jinx, you know, and being very fierce in that hatred, like I thought was cool. And I think that Caitlyn as a whole, not just in this episode, but in this kind of whole, you know, first act definitely was one of the strongest characters. And I mean, throughout the whole season, I think Caitlyn was one of the strongest and best characters. But now let's talk about something that I didn't like nearly as much, and that is these guys, the other enforcers. And really, from the moment that they came onto the screen, I didn't like them. Not because of what happens in the story, but because what doesn't happen in the story. Because this first scene, when we first get introduced to Maddie, who is this character here, I hate this scene. I really hated this scene. The reason that I hated this scene was, in this scene, Maddie comes up to Vi and is like, oh, you know, Caitlyn said all these things about you, and Caitlyn did this, and Caitlyn did this, and Caitlyn did that. And the whole time I'm thinking, why am I watching you, who up to this point, we have not seen this character in the entire show? Why am I watching you tell me this? Why am I not watching Caitlyn, who to this point, you know, in the episode has been like, ooh, Caitlyn's looking interesting. Why am I not seeing Caitlyn do that? Why am I not seeing a scene in the police station of Caitlyn saying, I'm going to take out my family's funding if you don't do this, if you don't do this. Showing Caitlyn, you know, kind of yearning for power. Why am I not seeing that? Why am I watching this random character up to this point just tell Vi this? Right? Like, this really, really annoyed me, this scene. And it just, like, set me against the whole enforcer thing straight away. And that carried on with, I don't even know this guy's name, to be honest. And this was a problem as well. That other than Maddie, who had obviously kind of, I don't want to say a crucial role, because it really wasn't a crucial role, right? And that, I think, is often the problem with these kind of characters, that you introduce them, they're kind of side characters, and they do something that's, you know, really important, but it's actually not that important by the end of the story, and we'll get to that. But, like, these characters, and why does he become an enforcer? I really don't understand. Vi's drinking with him. He seems like kind of like, you know, a homeless guy. And then all of a sudden he's an enforcer. Maybe I missed a scene. I don't know. Which, again, is the problem with the show that, you know, we'll get onto that. Yeah, this scene just really annoyed me. Speaking of scenes that I also didn't like, in episode 1 I felt like wasn't a great start. And that was, obviously, Chainsaw Lady here, one of the Chem Barons. This whole sequence made no sense. But there was much better ways of setting this up that I mean, if I can come up with it, I'm like, how didn't they come up with it, right? Because in this episode, we watched the council kind of, you know, deciding what to do. The members left of the council, we get the 2-to-1 votes or whatever, you know, and they're like, oh, we need to attack Zorn, right? Oh, no. We shouldn't use the Hextech weapons, though, right? Like, you know, we're getting votes back and forth, and they're discussing it. Why on earth didn't we also get the Chem Baron version of that, of them discussing now what to do, right? Silco is now dead. You know, there's a power vacuum there. Have the Chem Barons meet and talk about, like, hey, let's do this. And this happens later on in the show, but why wasn't this a part of it as well, right? This seems like such an obvious setup of, like, have the Chem Barons meet, have, you know, Chainsaw Lady here be like, I want revenge for my son because Jace killed my son, so let's go and attack them. And you could have the Rat Man, you know, that Jinx fights later on, you know, be like, no, we just need to sell off Jinx, you know, and keep the peace, right? And you can have this debate and have this character be a part of it. And then show, like, you know, the Chem Barons maybe disagreeing with this character, but then this character, you know, with the help of Ambassador, as we see later on, you know, then decide to just do it anyway, right? Like, instead, we just kind of get, like, a random, you know, extra attack, you know, for revenge for her son, essentially. But also, even though she wants revenge for her son, she's like just crawling around, you know, just like slowly going after Jace, you know, with like no fury or passion, you know, like that you would think, like, her motivation is, he killed my son. Why is she, you know, kind of just like slowly trekking around, like, you know, playing this little game with Jace? Who then, by the way, does get hit by this chainsaw in the back, and then it's never mentioned again. He never shows any hurt from being chainsawed in the back. He puts a little bandage over it, and it's never mentioned again. And this, I think, was the first real sense of, like, and this is going to be the key theme, I think, you know, of what I think of the entirety of Season 2, things went too fast. Okay, moving on to episode 2. Not too much to say about this one. I don't have too many complaints like I did with episode 1, other than maybe this should have been, you know, done before. You know, this kind of Chem Baron meeting here. But I do want to talk about Savika here, because Savika, I really liked Savika at this moment in time. We'll get into it by the end. But at this point, like, Savika and her direction of not wanting to sell out Jinx, because Jinx represents kind of the hope for Zorn, I loved it. I absolutely loved it, right? Because you're thinking, your expectation here is that Savika obviously hates Jinx and is going to want to sell out Jinx. But I love that kind of change of direction, which also makes sense, right? We'll get into Savika at the end of the show, which I have major problems with. But at this point, it makes sense, because Savika's whole thing is that she is kind of on board with that, I want a free zone, right? She was there with Vanda when Vanda seemed like the leader of the best chance to get a free zone, then moved to Silco when it seemed like Vanda wasn't the best option anymore, and Silco would be the best option for a free zone. Very clearly, Savika's main thing is, I want a free, independent zone, and I'm going to fight for that cause, right? And so it makes sense that Savika would be on Jinx's side, because Jinx represents the best chance for Zorn, you know, to be free, and scares Piltover, right? So I loved this. I love this direction. It wasn't fully expected. And also, speaking of interesting directions, right? Obviously, you know, if you play League and know the characters, you know, you kind of know generally where these characters are going to end up because you know their stories, right? But obviously they've changed Victor's story. So we didn't know where Victor was necessarily going to go, and they went in a very interesting, you know, Jesus kind of direction, right? Where, you know, Victor is quite different, and I don't think really anyone could have predicted this. You know, this was completely like, oh, this is interesting. You know, this kind of healing arc for Victor and him becoming, you know, fully kind of a mage essentially. I thought was, you know, a super interesting kind of wrinkle that, you know, I had no idea was coming. Moving on to episode 3. The next thing we'll talk about is the Black Rose. And the Black Rose, I thought, were also kind of a bit of a problem in this whole season of Arcane as well. That I mean, I'm somewhat familiar with... I don't play League, by the way, but I did play Legends of Runeterra, the card game, so I'm somewhat familiar with the characters, the general kind of story. I know what the Black Rose is, right? But I think if you're like my girlfriend, who is, you know, doesn't play League, has no idea, is just watching the show... I don't think the Black Rose is going to make any sense to you, right? And I don't think they did a very good job of it really explaining the Black Rose and maybe Noxian lore in general enough, right? I think in this first act, they really needed to dive into kind of the history of Noxus, the history of the Black Rose, you know, the history of Ambessa, you know, even more, and kind of really lay that out in thick detail so that everyone could understand, like, you know, who the Black Rose are, why this is all happening, because I think that the Black Rose just kind of, it just felt a bit more like they just turned up and all of a sudden they're a problem. But then we get back to kind of something that I really do like in the show, again, which is this moment of, you know, Caitlyn being like, you know, I'm going to take the shot anyway, even if there's a kid there or not. I'm going to kill Jinx. And Vi being like, no, what are you doing? You've become the Jinx now. And I really like that kind of reversal, again, of character. And I think that Caitlyn, again, was kind of the most interesting point of this kind of first act here. And then obviously Ambessa's power play, you know, again, was a nice kind of, you know, arc for these characters. And again, I liked, you know, it's like, ooh, are we rooting against Caitlyn now, right? And we are rooting for Jinx, whereas before it was like, it was Jinx the bad guy. You know, I did like all of that kind of thing going on, and I think that this was, you know, kind of coolly done. So I'm gonna read you the note that I made after I watched the first act, which is first act, 7 out of 10. Felt a little unfocused, not as clear as the first season, a lot going on. Highlight with the different animation styles and just overall production quality. Like Caitlyn this act, need more Jinx and Vi together, need more Jinx in general. Jace, Heimer, Echo, kinda meh, but Heimer funny. Ambessa and Mel have moments, interested for Black Rose and Warwick, but feels like one too many threads are being tugged right now, which we'll get into as we keep going. So now let's talk about Act 2. So in episode 4 then, one of the parts that I really, really liked is when we get Jinx and it's kind of like, you know, is Jinx gonna go mad again? Is she gonna start fighting again, right? And we're kind of confused and conflicted, I think, into what do we actually want to happen? Do we want Jinx to now just go crazy again? Like, is that what we're rooting for? You know, for Jinx to become insane and become kind of full Jinx mode again? Or do we want Jinx to be sane and be kind of, you know, healthier and happier? And I thought that was a really interesting moment of like, and again, obviously we get the kind of introduction of Warwick here, and obviously the moment here with Jinx and kind of understanding that, you know, Warwick is Vander and all of that. And I think that, again, this whole thing, that the Jinx dynamics here were really cool. You got the different animation style, again, for when Warwick is going crazy. I thought that that was really cool as well. So, you know, this kind of first episode of Act 2, I quite liked. Moving on to episode 5, and this was one of my favorite episodes, I think, of the entire season, which is the episode that is mainly focused on Jinx and Vi, you know, and Warwick, and kind of, you know, understanding, you know, that kind of dynamic between them, and essentially Jinx and Vi trying to, you know, bring back Vander, right? And I thought that, again, this was the show going back to, like, its strength, right? Its strength was the relationship between Jinx and Vi, and then you're adding in this relationship to Vander essentially as well in this, which I think, yeah, this is where the show was at its absolute best, and we kind of just returned to essentially what the show was really good at. The only one problem that I did have, though, which is to do with kind of the Warwick attack here as well earlier on, which is Ambessa. You know, we see Warwick, you know, kill all of these people, essentially, you know, in the prison. Ambessa is a part of that, and is actually, you know, kind of the first one that Warwick should be attacking as he comes out of the cage, because Ambessa's standing right there. But Ambessa just ends up absolutely fine. And this, I think, was a problem throughout, which is that unlike Silco, Ambessa had a big problem. That unlike Silco, there was seemingly no weakness to Ambessa, right? Ambessa had no weakness whatsoever in this. And I think that that was a major problem, right? Because for your main antagonist, if you look at Silco, right, there was even moments in the show where you're kind of rooting for Silco in season 1. Whereas with Ambessa, it's just like pure evil, right? There's just pure evil. There's no, there feels no grayness to it whatsoever, right? It's just like Ambessa is bad and nothing can hurt Ambessa apparently, you know, even when, you know, Warwick, who just killed everyone, you know, apparently Ambessa is just fine again, right? So there was, I think that that was a big problem as well, that your main antagonist, unlike in season 1 where the main antagonist was, you know, kind of gray at moments, and even at sometimes you're like, well, are you right here? You know, like, you just want a really free zone. Yeah, you're kind of a bad guy, but are you fighting for a good cause? Like, you know, whereas Ambessa is just like, no, you're just fighting to, you know, control everything essentially and be in charge of everyone. And you're also a crazy good fighter that apparently can never take any damage from anyone. Yeah, you're just bad, right? And it was, and I think we lost that bit of sense of gray in the story as well, which I think really started with when Warwick, who should have probably killed Ambessa, instead didn't do any damage whatsoever. We also, though, got Singed, and kind of the Singed story here, obviously, with his daughter. And this, again, was one of, you know, I think the major kind of good parts of the story, right? I really like Singed whenever Singed was on screen, because, again, it just felt like you didn't fully know what was necessarily going to be happening. You don't know whether to root for Singed or not, I think, in a lot of these times, which I just think, again, made him a very, very interesting character, you know, a very grey character if you're not quite sure what to think. And then at the end of the episode, I wrote in my notes, I like Mad Jace. Still lots of mystery to be resolved. Is there enough time to resolve it all? Which, yes, again, did turn out to be a little bit of a problem by the end. But yeah, I liked the Mad Jace thing. I liked this kind of like, you know, again, like kind of strange character development. You know, at this point, obviously we get the kind of reveal of why that happened. But, you know, at this point, it's just like Jace has become mad and we're kind of intrigued to see, you know, why and what's going to happen next. Okay, moving on to episode 6, and here we get kind of an explanation of Noxus, right? When Caitlyn and Ambessa are fighting. For me, this should have come probably in the first episode, if I'm being honest, right? We needed a much bigger, I think, Noxus explanation, much kind of earlier on, you know, if Ambessa and both the Black Rose were kind of gonna be somewhat, you know, central figures to kind of the antagonists of the story. But now let's come to this, which is the kind of magical element, right? When we started to, I think this is where the story started to slightly go off the rails a little bit. And the reason for that is, and I know the story is called Arcane, so there's going to be magic involved in a story called Arcane. Like, I understand, I get it, but you have to be very careful, I think, when you are writing a story, you know, with heavy magic elements in it, because you're going to end up at a point potentially where everything can just be explained, well, magic, right? Like, it just happened because magic. And that's not a very good explanation for a story, right? But I think that that's because of like the rushed elements that we ended up with as well, you know, kind of going on as the story went on. We did end up with quite a few things that were just kind of like, well, it happened because magic happened, right? And there's no kind of deeper understanding that we can make as an audience because it's magic. And guess what? In the real world, no one has magic. And by this point, I think in the story, we end up with some really nice scenes like this one with Singed and Victor and them kind of explaining their, you know, viewpoints on the world now and how, you know, they've grown as people and what they think. And I think that that's cool, right? And we'd end up with these scenes, but we'd end up in these scenes in strange ways, right? Like, for instance, when, you know, Ambessa and her army are marching towards kind of Victor's, you know, little place, you know, it didn't make sense to me. Like, Singed just says, oh, don't worry, I'll talk to him, don't worry about it. Like, why would Ambessa trust Singed that much? You know, like, we just end up with kind of like questions of like, why would you do that though? Why not just march in there now straight away? Like, why does Ambessa wait to march in on the camp? I don't know. But then obviously we get, I think, one of the best action sequences in the entire show, which is obviously with Ishtar here. Now, I thought it was funny because French music starts playing, and so the joke that me and my girlfriend made was that maybe Ishtar is just French, and that's why she doesn't speak. She can only understand French. But obviously this whole scene was great, apart from one thing again, which is again Ambessa somehow comes out of this completely fine. Everyone else is kind of struggling, you know, we're wounded. Ambessa can't take any damage. It's just immune. So my Act 2 review was this at the time. Act 2, 7 out of 10. Again, Warwick reunion and story was really cool. Like the reversal of characters and shifting arcs. Again, not a fan of small detail stuff like Ambessa immune to all damage and has no foil. The story is maybe getting a little complex, but Jinx Vi story keeping it going strong. But now let's move to Act number 3. And we start with episode 7, which is essentially the Jinx Echo episode. This was the best episode of the season, I think, and I don't think it's particularly close, right? So this is the episode that is largely focused on Echo, Heimer, and Jace going to kind of the different dimensions and kind of, you know, seeing different realities and how they played out. And this episode was just insanely good, right? And one of the main reasons this episode was insanely good was because the pace slowed way down. Right, it slowed way down for this episode compared to some of the other episodes and what's coming next. Like, the pace slowed way down, and it was just a really nice, like, self-contained story in a sense. It was just pretty much everything about it I liked. I really just liked this episode. Now, obviously, in this episode as well, we got Heimer's sacrifice, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought in the lore Yordles couldn't die and they were kind of immortal. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true in the Arcane lore, but obviously, if Yordles are immortal, then it does kind of take away from Heimer doing this kind of big grand sacrifice, because then it's not really a big grand sacrifice if he's just going to live through it anyway. So I don't know exactly what happened here. Okay, now let's move to episode 8, and this is where I think it really starts to go off the rails a little bit with the story here, where again, I kind of mentioned in episode 5, my end of episode 5 review, that I thought there was a lot that needed to be resolved. And it turned out, yeah, we just got it kind of all resolved, happening very quickly in the space of 2 episodes. It starts off with Jinx, and like, again, this just all happened way too fast, right? With Jinx's character here, where, you know, Jinx, after this, gives herself in, becomes mad, you know, locks Vi in here anyway. Even, is she blaming Vi all of a sudden? Like, why is she angry with Vi? I don't really know. We don't really get that sense. And then later on, you know, that we'll get to, you know, she's instantly kind of corrected back by Echo in a short scene conversation as well. So we just had a lot going on here in not very much time, and I think that Jinx's character is a pretty good example of that. We also, I think, as we start to see, you know, Victor really push for his grand vision of the world here, we start to lose that sense of grey. Probably, I think, one of, if not the best thing about the entirety of Season 1 was that it was very grey. You know, you had characters that were kind of good and kind of bad, but if you looked at it in a different perspective, right, like a character like Caitlyn, you could see as, you know, an oppressor of the people of Zonin. You could see Silco as a freedom fighter, right? If you wanted to kind of swap the roles around, right, you could do that. Here in Season 2, I think by the time we got to this part, there was no grey, right? Victor and his, you know, cyber robotic world and Ambessa were clearly bad, and the others fighting against that therefore have to be kind of clearly good, right? And with Victor, I guess there's a sense of grey because he thinks he's doing the right thing, but we, the audience, know that he's not, right? So we have kind of lost that sense of grey. We know who we're rooting for, which again, I personally like stories that have a lot of grey. So, you know, maybe that's a personal thing, but I did think we lost that kind of sense of it. And there were other questions as well, where I think, again, because we were going so fast at this point in the story, we were losing some of kind of the detail as well, right? Of like, is Caitlyn still like this dictator of all of Piltover? I don't know. And I think we lost in general kind of the sense of the wider world, right? Of like, what is going on in Zone? Like, what is going on in Piltover? Like, what is going on? And then we have to talk about Savika. Okay, now this isn't from this episode, this is from earlier on because I couldn't find the screenshot, but at the end of this episode, Jace basically, you know, calls a council of all these different people saying, hey, we need to stop, you know, Victor and Ambessa from, you know, taking it all over and whatever, and he calls this council of people and he's like, oh, will you help me fight? And Savika is one of the people who is there. And this is one of the things, in fact, this I think is my most hated thing about the entire show. Because I just talked about that lack of sense of the world and what's going on. Why on earth would Savika turn up in Piltover? To surely, like, Savika's character, if Savika got an invite from Jace to be like, hey, come and meet, you know, at the head council building in Piltover, Savika would probably think, well, this is an obvious trap. They're going to kill me, right? Like, why would Savika go to this? Why would Savika want to help? Savika wants a free zone. Why would helping Piltover, the people that she hates, why would she agree to do this? It makes no sense. And as I said, we just completely lost the wider sense of world. And unfortunately for Savika, her character just ends up a complete mess of just a nothing husk of a character. Okay, into episode 9, the final episode. And we start with, in my opinion, probably the best scene of the episode, right? Which is the Echo convincing Jinx by, you know, going back in time, you know, to come back on side, right? Again, should Jinx have gone from kind of sane to crazy back to sane in the space of, you know, a couple scenes that we see of Jinx? Probably not. But whatever, this actual scene, I liked, right? And again, to be honest, I wanted this scene to be longer. I wanted this scene to last 10 minutes, but it didn't. It was, you know, relatively short. But this, to me, you know, was probably the best scene of this final episode. Now we come to kind of the siege of, you know, Piltover, essentially, from the Noxian army. And look, Arcane is not the first show that is guilty of this. Many, many, many shows are guilty of this. But anytime you get these very long, extended action sequences, I know that for some people, they like that, right? Like, and if you do like it, by the way, that's absolutely fine. This is just my kind of personal taste. I hate long, extended action sequences. Because to me, often, you know, in most of these stories that have these kind of, you know, extended action sequences that go on for, you know, 20, 30 minutes, they just make no sense if you give them even a moment's thought, right? No one's character makes any sense in any of it, right? Like, for instance, here in this scene, right, when Ambessa dies, these guys just kind of pound their chest quickly. Why aren't they then just like, why have they stopped? Like, wouldn't they then just kill Mel? Wouldn't they just continue? Like, are they not doing their job? Their commander dies and they just completely stop and stand in like a little formation here. None of it makes any sense. And in fact, I wrote a list of things that don't make sense during this siege. So at one point, one of the enforcers, the blue guy, I don't know his name, but the blue guy enforcer that's in the show every so often, right? They throw those like gas canisters and he doesn't have a mask. And initially I was like, oh, I guess his race or whatever, you know, doesn't need a mask. Then he starts coughing. Why didn't he have a mask? I don't know. Also, another thing is Zorn then later on comes into the fight, which makes no sense. Again, it's like, well, one, if they were going to fight, why are they joining when it like looks all hope is lost, right? What? Why not just join the fight from the start? Where were they? What were they doing? And second, why on earth Zorn should be on the other side? They should be with Noxus tearing this place down. There is nothing that has suggested that Piltover has made massive concessions to Zorn to, like, you know, get them on side to fight for this. They're just doing it just cause. What? That makes no sense. Then we see, obviously, all this big siege stuff going on. And then it turns out that Victor has just walked to the front door of the thing that he was trying to get to the whole time, right? Why is no one in there defending the thing that we know that they want to go after? Why is it literally just Jace? Surely that's where, like, a good portion, you know, you should have kind of one last stand of people there to defend that with their lives. But no, it's just Jace. And so then we kind of, you know, end up in Interstellar mode after all of the action sequence has gone on. And here in Interstellar mode, again, we're just left to accept whatever happens, right? Because, you know, this has no basis for anything that we can connect to in real life. So we just kind of have to go, okay, sure, right? Like, why does that rune, you know, the Jace was given by Victor in like a different timeline, you know, when he was a kid, why does that rune end all of this? I don't know. Magic? Cool. Obviously, then we get Jinx's death, and this was, you know, a really nice moment, I think, overall. I assume Jinx is dead. I guess I don't even fully know, but I'm going to call it Jinx and Warwick's death here, which, again, was nice. Kind of feels kind of Star Wars-esque here, you know, with them dropping down. That I couldn't get Star Wars kind of out of my head at this moment, but, yeah, this was cool. And then Savika joins the council, and again, I'm just repeating what I said before, but I hated the way that this ended for Savika. Savika, I thought, was on track to be one of the coolest characters, and I don't think Savika got a speaking line in the last act. And Savika joins the council, which again, just in my opinion, makes absolutely no sense. And so overall, you know, was just too rushed, right? I really do think it comes back to that just too much was happening too fast. And that just causes a lot of other problems as well, where characters don't make sense, the world doesn't make sense, right? Like, you know, you just end up with all these other things that, with any kind of scratching at the surface, you just end up with a bunch of questions that never get answered, which is, you know, a problem. So I think it really does all come back to it being too rushed. I think this could have easily been 3 seasons as well. You know, they could have easily ended season 2 with Isha's death. Right, with that scene with Warwick, and they would have had more time to flesh things out and, you know, really kind of build this story. You know, again, like, think about, like, you know, you might be like, oh, they couldn't turn those 3 episodes into a full season, but they really probably could have done, right? Like I said, like, imagine you could spend a whole, like, 2-3 episodes just on kind of, like, you know, Piltover having to give concessions to Zorn so that Zorn will fight for Piltover now, right? And they have to come together to fight a Noxian invasion instead, right? You spend a lot of time going through that and the politics of that and all of the different characters and what they think of that, right? That could have taken a significant amount of time. Instead, it was done in one, like, 10-second scene, right? So there was a lot to flesh out that they didn't, and that's a shame. But yeah, this was my review. Again, if anything I've said you don't agree with and you feel very differently, you like the show, you know, and you'd give it a 9 out of 10, that's fine, right? That's cool. I don't like obviously it's still good, you know. I mean, production wise, it's amazing. So yeah, I can understand it. But yeah, for me, just a bit too rushed. But let me know what you think in the comments down below.